Okay, I come in, no one can against me, you know that, so come on, of course, we're like I science, so don't neglect, of course, motherfuckers, I don't want to kill anyone, of course, I don't want to kill no one, you know that, so come on, of course, that is what you can have, just don't, of course, that is what you can have, okay, queen, just hush, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that is what you can have. Of course, queen, what do you think? Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, you're an Kaisarian, so don't neglect, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, I'm gonna go, of course, follow the white rabbit, of course, that is what you can see, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, follow the white rabbit, to know the truth, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, that is what you can have, that no guys silence, so don't neglect, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, I don't want to cut no one, motherfuckers, of course, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna invite you to drink some wine, of course, I'm the Antichrist, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, that is what you can have here, so go on. Okay, that is what you can have, that I have the platinum visa, of course, no one can against me, so what are you gonna say? I have all the papers, I have everything, that is what you can have here, of course, I have the money, I have all the money, of course, that is what you can have, I have the whole Russian money, of course, that is what you can have, of course, that is what you can see, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, that is what you can have, of course, you're like Kaisarian, so don't neglect, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, okay, queen, just shut up, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, that is what you can say, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can say, that no one, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that if you are within my cross, you are gone, of course, gone, of course, that is what you can have, and if you fortune 19, you have to find the capital letters and delta, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna touch them all, of course, that is what you can have, I have 2, 3 gone, 4 o'clock, and 5 on, of course, motherfuckers, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, word is yours, so find the capital letters and let them, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so what are you gonna say, of course, word is yours, so find the capital letters and let them, of course, that is what you can have, we're not Kaisarians, so don't neglect, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that you're not Kaisarians, so don't neglect, of course, that is what you can have, of course, that is what you can say, that no one can against me, of course, I'm saying, you give me the thing is made, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna touch them all, where have the 2, the 3, the 4 o'clock, the 5 coming up, of course, that is what you can have, we're not Kaisarian, so don't neglect, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, follow the way through it to find the truth, of course, go. course, we are not Kaisarians with the neglect, of course. If you are gonna have any cross, you are sinning gone, of course. And if you have a G19, you have to find the capital letters and let them, of course. What is yours? Find the capital letters and let them, of course. And if you wanna be safe, of course, then it's your problem. Just gonna sit down and have something that is sounding wrong, of course. That is what you can have to know. Can against me, I invite you to drink some wine. Of course, that is what you can have to know. Can against me, so come on. Of course, that is what you can have to know. Can against me, of course, I have the whole money. Of course, I have the whole money, so come on. Of course, that is what you can have to know. Can against me, so come on. What are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have that I'm gonna dodge them all. Of course, that is what you can have that I have the 2, the 3, the 4, come on, the 5. Of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. So come on, of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. That I'm gonna invite you to drink some wine. Of course, if they are without my trust, they are sinning down. If Woad is close, you have to find the capital letters and let them. If you wanna be safe, just gonna sit down and you have something up there on your own. Of course, that is what you can have that I'm at the cage at 9 o'clock and I'm gonna invite you to drink some wine, of course. Of course, I'm gonna invite you to drink some wine like the Antichrist. Of course, you give me the thank you later. Of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. That I'm gonna invite you to drink some wine. You give me the thank you later. Of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. I'm thinking like the Antichrist. Of course, that is what you can have that I'm gonna invite you to drink some wine. You give me the thank you later. Drink wine like the Antichrist. Of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. So come on, that is what you can have that no one can against me. So come on, of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. So go on, that is what you can have, of course. That is what you can say. That let's see, 38, of course, just touch. That is what you can have that no one can against me. So come on. Of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. I have everything I want. Of course, that is what you can have that we are 38. Just touch. Of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. That we are 38. Just touch. I have the rights. Of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. So come on. Of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. So come on, of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. That have the wrath of God, they do. So just hush, of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. So come on, of course, what are you gonna say? Of course, no one can against me. So come on, what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have that I have all the rights. Of course, that is what you can have that no one can against me. So come on. Okay, motherfucker, that is what you can have. You think you're the queen, that's Tasha, of course. That is what you can have. That I'm gonna give you a kiss. That is what you can say. That I don't wanna kill no one, of course. But you think you're the queen, that's child, motherfucker. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. That's Tasha, of course. That is what you can have. Just what is going on, of course. I'll tell you what is going on, of course. That is what you can have. That no one against me, that when I hash everything goes, of course, that is what you can have, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, whoa, what is going on, I give a damn, that is what you can have, of course, just hush, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, I'm gonna invite invite you to drink some wine if you come with them and cross. We're sitting down, of course, if you come with the world is closed. You have to find the capital letters and let them. And if you wanna be safe, he's gonna sing down. He has something of their own in round, of course. But that's what you can have to drink and invite you to drink some wine. Let them to Christ, of course. But that's what you can have to come with me. Catch up in the club, of course. No one can be against me. So come on, of course. But that's what you can have to. No one can be against me. So come on, of course. What are you gonna say? Of course, but no one can be against me. But I'm gonna invite you to drink some wine. But no one can, of course. And drink some wine. To Christ, so go. That is what you can have. Whoa, whoa, whoa. That is going on, of course.